You know that feeling when you push the throttle forward and the airplane just goes? Not gradually, not eventually, but right now. For fighter pilots in the late 1950s, one aircraft promised that feeling like no other, the F-104 Starfighter. Sleek as a stiletto, fast as a bullet, and according to Lockheed's marketing, surprisingly easy to fly. It looked like pure speed sitting on the ramp with its tiny razor-thin wings and needle-nose fuselage. This wasn't just another fighter. This was the future. A Mach 2 interceptor that could climb to 50,000 feet in a matter of minutes and outrun anything else in the sky. Kelly Johnson and his legendary Skunk Works team had done it again, turning what seemed impossible into metal and thrust. Air forces around the world lined up to buy it. Germany ordered 916 of them, Canada, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, Japan, all wanted in. The promise was irresistible, high performance at a reasonable price, a fighter that could meet the Soviet threat head-on without bankrupting the treasury. The F-104 could hit Mach 2.2 in level flight and climb at over 50,000 feet per minute with afterburner. It could reach altitudes where the sky turned dark purple and you could see the curvature of the Earth. For intercepting high-altitude Soviet bombers, which was the mission it was designed for, it was exactly what the Air Force needed. Test pilots who flew it in California's clear skies reported that it was responsive, honest, and thrilling. Pure pilot's airplane, they said. Light on the controls, eager to accelerate, a joy to fly fast and high where it belonged. The Starfighter rewarded smooth inputs and punished hesitation. Get it right, and you felt like you were riding a rocket. Every Air Force that looked at it saw the same thing. A relatively simple, affordable air superiority fighter that could outperform anything the Soviets had. The Cold War was running hot. NATO needed a standard fighter, and developing a new indigenous design would take years and cost billions. The F-104 was available now, proven, and came with the Lockheed name behind it. But what test pilots in California understood and what operational squadrons would soon learn the hard way was that the Starfighter's performance came with a price. Those tiny wings that made it so fast also made it unforgiving. The engine that pushed it past Mach 2 had a habit of quitting at the worst possible moment, and the flight envelope that felt so honest at high speed and high altitude became a deadly trap down low where operational flying actually happened. To understand why, you have to go back to the drawing board in 1952 when Kelly Johnson decided to design the ultimate interceptor by throwing out everything that made fighters safe. Kelly Johnson didn't design the F-104 in a vacuum. He designed it in response to what fighter pilots told him they needed after bleeding in the skies over Korea. They wanted speed to catch MiGs, climb rate to get above them, and altitude performance to dominate the fight. Johnson's answer was radical. Strip away every ounce of unnecessary weight, minimize drag to an obsessive degree, and accept whatever compromises that required. The result was a fighter pilot's fighter, but only if that pilot never made a mistake. The design philosophy was brutal in its simplicity. Those tiny wings weren't just small, they were the smallest practical wing that could keep the airplane flying. At 196 square feet, supporting a loaded weight of over 20,000 pounds, the wing loading was astronomical compared to other fighters. The F-100 Super Sabre carried about 65 pounds per square foot of wing. The F-104 carried over 100. What that meant in practice was simple. The Starfighter had to fly fast, or it didn't fly at all. The razor-thin wing profile, just 3.36 inches at the root, tapering to a knife edge, gave it incredibly low drag at high speed, but aerodynamics doesn't give you something for nothing. What they gained in speed and efficiency, they lost in lift at low speeds and any margin for error. What Lockheed gained was extraordinary. The F-104 was fast, simple, and could climb like nothing else in the inventory. What they lost was forgiveness. The stall characteristics were sudden and vicious. Where most fighters gave you buffet, wallowing, mushiness, some warning that you were approaching the edge, the F-104 would simply snap. One moment you had an airplane, the next moment you had a falling brick with your name on it. The engine, a General Electric J79, was powerful enough to push the aircraft past Mach 2, but it was temperamental. Compressor stalls plagued the design. Fire the M61 Vulcan cannon, and the gun gas could get ingested into the intake, flaming out the engine entirely. At high altitude, you might have time to restart. Down low, you were Already planning your funeral? Test pilots documented all of this. They reported that the F-104 was magnificent in its intended role: high, fast, clean air. They also reported that it was dangerous everywhere else. Recommendations went up the chain for design modifications, for extended testing, for caution in deployment. But this was the Cold War. The Soviets weren't waiting for Lockheed to perfect the design. Military pressure to get the aircraft into operational service overrode engineering caution. Production decisions were made before the problems were solved, before pilots had fully mapped the deadly edges of the flight envelope. By 1958, the first operational squadrons were receiving their Starfighters, and the dying was about to begin. The crashes started almost immediately. Air Defense Command got their first F-104s in 1958, and within months, the accident reports were stacking up. Pilots were dying in training flights, in routine intercepts, in scenarios that should have been straightforward. The aircraft that performed so beautifully at altitude became a killer down low where pilots actually had to operate. On approach, the F-104's sink rate was vicious. Those tiny wings generated just enough lift to keep you flying fast but slow down for landing, and the airplane dropped like a stone. Pilots accustomed to conventional fighters found themselves sinking hundreds of feet per minute, the runway disappearing as they fought to arrest the descent without stalling. Add a gust of wind or a momentary distraction, and you were out of options before you realized you had a problem. The pitch-up characteristic was even worse. At high angles of attack, the F-104 would suddenly and violently pitch nose up, snapping into an uncontrollable condition that could rip the aircraft apart or put it into a flat spin. Recovery was often impossible. The T-tail made it worse. Get slow enough, get the nose high enough, and the elevator stopped working entirely as the wing wake blanked it out. You could pull the stick into your lap and nothing would happen. You were just along for the ride until impact. The engine compounded every problem. J-79 flameouts became routine enough that pilots briefed for them before every flight. But briefing for an engine failure and surviving one at 500 feet on final approach were two very different things. With only one engine, there was no backup. When it quit, you had seconds to decide: try to restart or get out. At low altitude, neither option was good, and there was no two-seat trainer. Your first flight in an F-104 was solo. Pilots transitioning from forgiving aircraft like the F-86 Sabre suddenly found themselves strapped into a fighter that punished hesitation and rewarded only perfection. The learning curve was measured in destroyed aircraft and flag-draped coffins. By the early 1960s, the statistics were undeniable. The Air Force was losing F-104s at a rate that shocked even seasoned accident investigators. Estimates suggest the USAF lost 40 to 50% of their starfighters to accidents, not in combat, in training, in ferry flights, in routine operations. Squadrons began to dread flying it. Some were grounded for safety reviews. Modifications were attempted, flight restrictions imposed, procedures rewritten. Nothing fixed the fundamental problem. The aircraft had no margin for error, and operational flying demanded margin constantly. The Air Force's response was pragmatic. By the early 1960s, they began phasing the F-104 out of frontline service. The interceptor mission was being taken over by aircraft with better radar, longer range, and more forgiving flight characteristics. The Starfighter had proven itself too specialized, too unforgiving, too expensive in pilot lives. But even as the United States was backing away from the design, international sales were accelerating. NATO countries were committing to the F-104G variant by the hundreds. Germany ordered 916 aircraft. Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, Canada, Japan all signed contracts. Lockheed promised that the upgraded version had solved the problems, that lessons learned were incorporated, that this time it would be different. What the USAF had learned in American skies, Allied air forces were about to learn in theirs, and the lessons would be written in blood. Germany's commitment to the F-104 wasn't just about buying fighters. It was about rebuilding the Luftwaffe, about NATO obligations, about standing on the front line of the Cold War with credible air power. The scale was enormous, 916 aircraft, making Germany the largest F-104 operator in the world. The deal included licensed production in Germany, which meant jobs, technology transfer, and industrial capability. In the early 1960s, this looked like exactly what West Germany needed: Modern jet fighters for a modern air force facing Soviet threat across the border. The optimism didn't last long. The crashes started in 1962 and never really stopped. German F-104s began falling out of the sky at a rate that shocked the public and terrified the pilots flying them. By the mid-1960s, the statistics were impossible to ignore. German starfighters were crashing at nearly double the rate of other NATO operators. Pilots were dying in training accidents, in operational missions, in circumstances that shouldn't have been fatal in more forgiving aircraft. The names accumulated, the widows accumulated. The term Witwenmacher, widowmaker, became the aircraft's unofficial German name. Public outcry grew from murmur to roar as more young pilots died and more families demanded answers. Germany's experience was worse than anyone else's for reasons that became clear only after the bodies were counted. The mission profile was all wrong. Germany needed a low-level strike fighter that could penetrate Soviet air defenses and deliver nuclear weapons. The F-104 was a high-altitude interceptor being forced into the worst possible regime for its design. Down low, in bad weather, threading between hills in the combat profile Germany actually needed, the starfighter's lack of margin became immediately lethal. European weather wasn't California sunshine. Pilots were flying in clouds, in rain, in conditions where visibility disappeared and instrument flying was mandatory. The aircraft that was tricky but manageable in clear air became a widowmaker in instrument conditions where you couldn't see the ground rushing up until it was too late. Training was rushed. The Luftwaffe was rebuilding from scratch, and getting pilots through transition training quickly was prioritized over getting them through safely. Maintenance was complex. The F-104 wasn't a simple airplane despite Lockheed's claims, and German maintenance crews were learning its quirks while trying to keep a large fleet airworthy. Pilot experience varied wildly. Some were veterans who understood the aircraft's demands. Others were newer pilots still learning to be fighter pilots while simultaneously learning to survive the starfighter's unforgiving nature. The combination was deadly. By the 1970s, the political pressure was explosive. Parliamentary inquiries investigated the procurement process. Defense ministers resigned. Accusations of corruption in the original purchase decision began surfacing. Public demonstrations featured the widows of dead pilots demanding accountability. The statistics that emerged were damning. Over 110 German pilots would eventually die in F-104 accidents, with hundreds of aircraft destroyed. The modifications came in waves: improved ejection seats that could save you at lower altitudes, stability augmentation systems to smooth out some of the handling quirks, operational restrictions that limited what missions could be flown in what conditions. Training programs were extended, simulator time increased, qualification standards tightened, but none of it addressed the fundamental problem. The F-104 was still a point design optimized for one mission being used for another. Other NATO countries faced similar problems, though none quite as severe as Germany's. Canada lost pilots and aircraft. Italy and the Netherlands experienced their own waves of accidents. The question everyone was asking became unavoidable. Was this the right aircraft for NATO's actual mission? The answer, as test pilots and engineers had known from the beginning, was no. The question everyone should have been asking was, why did we buy it anyway? The F-104 wasn't a bad design. It was a specialized design being used for missions it was never meant to fly. Kelly Johnson had designed exactly what he was asked to design, a high-altitude interceptor optimized for speed and climb rate. The tragedy was that almost no one used it that way. Understanding why it killed requires understanding what those design compromises actually meant when physics took over. The wing loading told most of the story. At over 100 pounds per square foot, the F-104 needed speed to generate enough lift to fly. Slow down, and those tiny wings simply couldn't produce enough lift to keep 20,000 pounds of fighter airborne without an enormous angle of attack. The stall speed was high, around 198 miles per hour indicated, which doesn't sound terrible until you realize that's with everything working perfectly. Add a little ice, a little turbulence, a distracted pilot, and that number crept higher. The margin between flying speed and stalling speed, especially in the landing configuration, was razor thin. The coffin corner was real, and it was deadly. Too fast, and you risked structural damage or loss of control, too slow, and you stalled. The window between those two conditions narrowed with altitude until, at the F-104's maximum ceiling, there was almost no safe speed at all. Down low in the ground, attack role Germany needed, that same problem manifested differently. You had to fly fast to stay safe, but flying fast at low altitude meant you had almost no time to react to terrain, to threats, to mechanical failures. The adverse yaw characteristics meant the airplane wanted to swap ends on you during aggressive maneuvering. The pitch-up boundary could appear without warning, cross it, and the aircraft would violently nose up, potentially beyond your ability to recover before overstressing the airframe or entering a spin. The J-79 engine was powerful, but it had a personality. The compressor was sensitive to disrupted airflow. Fire the cannon and gun, gas could flow back into the intake, disrupting the carefully balanced airflow the compressor needed. The result was a flameout, often at the worst possible moment. Single engine meant no redundancy. When that J-79 quit, you had one power plant and no backup. At altitude, you might have time to attempt an air start. Down low, by the time you realized the engine wasn't going to light, you were already making the decision to eject or die with the airplane. The ejection seat evolution told its own story. Early pilots who punched out at low altitude using the downward firing seat were killed by ground impact before their parachutes opened. The switch to upward firing seats solved that problem, but created another. There was a minimum altitude below which ejection was still fatal. Too high to survive the crash, too low to eject successfully. Pilots died in that band regularly. The training gap was fundamental. Even after two-seat trainers became available, they couldn't fully replicate the danger. Simulators of that era were primitive. They could teach procedures, but they couldn't teach you what the edge of the envelope felt like, couldn't teach you the split-second recognition that you were about to die unless you did exactly the right thing right now. The combination of pilot confidence and aircraft unforgiving nature was lethal. Pilots who were good, who were experienced, who thought they understood the airplane, died because they made one small mistake in an aircraft that punished small mistakes with death. Chuck Yeager flew the F-104 and called it an honest airplane that would kill you if you didn't respect it. German pilots who survived their tours echoed the same theme: constant vigilance, no relaxation, no assumptions, no mistakes. The F-104 demanded perfection in an environment where perfection was impossible to maintain. Good weather, bad weather, combat, peacetime, fatigue, distraction, mechanical issues, all of these are constants in operational flying. The Starfighter had no margin to accommodate any of them. The final numbers are stark. Lockheed built 2,578 F-104 Starfighters in all variants. Over 1,000 of them were lost to accidents, roughly 40% of the entire production run. More than 300 pilots died. Compare that to other fighters of the same era, and the F-104 stands out as one of the deadliest aircraft ever operated by Western air forces. Not in combat, in peacetime operations, training flights, and routine missions. But the story isn't entirely one of failure. The F-104 set speed and altitude records that stood for years. It flew successful missions when used in its intended role. Some countries operated it effectively by matching the aircraft to appropriate missions and investing heavily in training. Taiwan flew the F-104 for decades with a relatively good safety record by keeping pilots proficient and using it primarily for air superiority. Italy operated theirs into the 2000s, eventually learning how to manage the risks. There are pilots who love the Starfighter, who defend it to this day, who say it was the finest aircraft they ever flew. And they're not wrong, as long as you understand the context. Flown within its envelope by a proficient pilot in good conditions, it was magnificent. The business scandal that emerged in the 1970s cast a darker shadow over the entire program. Lockheed's bribery scandal revealed that officials in Germany, Japan, Italy, and the Netherlands had been paid off to secure F-104 contracts. German officials were implicated, Japanese officials went to prison. The revelation added a sickening context to all those deaths. The aircraft hadn't been selected purely on merit. Some of those contracts had been secured through corruption, not capability. Profits had been prioritized over pilots, and the human cost could now be measured in both lives lost and democracy corrupted. But the F-104's legacy isn't just about what went wrong. It's about what changed because of it. Fighter design philosophy shifted fundamentally after the Starfighter's experience. Margin mattered. Forgiveness mattered. The next generation of fighters incorporated fly-by-wire flight control systems specifically to expand the safe flight envelope and prevent the kind of departures and upsets that killed F-104 pilots. Ejection seat technology improved dramatically, driven by the need to save pilots at all altitudes and airspeeds. Transition training requirements were enhanced across the board. Modern fighters emphasize what's called carefree maneuvering, the idea that the aircraft should protect the pilot from its own limitations rather than demanding the pilot never make a mistake. The parallels to other aircraft disasters are obvious. Different scale, same pattern. Optimism overtaking engineering caution. Marketing glossing over operational reality. Production pressure preventing proper problem solving. The cost of rushing instead of getting it right. The F-104 and the BD-5 share that fundamental flaw. Designers who believe so deeply in their vision that they convinced others to bet their lives on it before the problems were solved. What flying the F-104 taught those who survived was respect. Respect for margins, for conservatism, for the idea that exciting and safe don't have to be opposites. Some pilots still defend it, pointing out that it could be flown safely with proper training and discipline. Others call it a widowmaker without hesitation, remembering friends who died. Both perspectives are valid, because both are true. The F-104 wasn't evil or cursed. It was physics. It was a design that prioritized one thing above all else and paid for it in pilot lives. Kelly Johnson designed what was asked for. The tragedy was using it for missions it wasn't built to fly. There's no such thing as easy to fly when the margins disappear. That feeling when you push the throttle forward and the airplane just goes? The F-104 gave you that, but it also gave you absolute certainty that one mistake, one moment of distraction, one mechanical failure could be your last. And for hundreds of pilots it was, don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My friend, who is a commercial pilot, said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories about airlines and the realities of modern travel like this deserve to be told. Help me show her that these videos matter. Please subscribe to the channel and let's keep these stories from being buried.